Hello, everyone. Welcome to the LinkedIn Live. Before I kind of do my official intro, I just want to make sure everyone has time to kind of settle in. So as you come in, everyone, please say hi in the chat. I'll try to say hi back, and then we can kind of get things rolling. Hope everyone is having a good end of the year. Those Q4 things aren't killing you too much. And if anyone missed it, as people stroll in, can you say hi to the chat? Just so I can see. We're going to get things rolling in about a minute or so. Hello, everyone. Just as a reminder, if you're just popping in, can you say hi in the chat just so I can see you rolling in? Okay. Probably give it another 30 seconds or so and get things popping off. Hey, Shay. Hey, John. Hi, Cheryl. Thank you. Was feeling a
You're
little
welcome.
feeling a little lonely up here, y'all. Hi. Thanks for rolling in. Okay. Cool. Hi, Melissa. Hi, Vanessa. Okay, cool. So it seems like people are strolling in, so I'll kind of start things off. Hello, monsters. Thank you to our final LinkedIn Live of the year, where we will be recapping the hottest topics and the hottest trends over the last year. There's been a lot going on with antitrust cases, the rise of generative AI, the cookie deprecation pause that went on. So we kind of wanted to get things rolling off and talk about it. Today, joining me, I have Chris Kane from Jounce Media, who will be talking with through this. Thank you for joining me, Chris.
It's great to be here. Thanks for setting it up.
Of course. And before we kind of get into the nitty gritty of the conversation, one thing I always like to do to get the conversation started is to do icebreakers to kind of get the blood flowing. So one thing I wanted to start off with was, what was the piece of ad tech news this year that shocked you the most?
It's a good icebreaker.
Mhm.
I feel like there's like lots of big news, but most of it isn't shocking. Like if you're like deep in the industry, which I like to think I am, like you can kind of make sense of most of the news. But I think the one that I guess, to try to answer your question, the one that I feel like I continue to be surprised by, or like I continue to sort of make sense of, is the Trade Desk's decision to launch their own connected TV operating system.
Mm.
Um, and like a very superficial level, it's like, well, the Trade Desk has bet their future on connected TV, and so it makes sense that they're making investments in the CTV space.
Mhm.
But I continue to struggle, and I don't think I'll try to struggle live here, but I continue to struggle to understand, like, what's the play there? Like that's a very thoughtful organization. They have a good track record of making sort of like well considered strategic bets. This feels like one of those, and yet I kind of struggle to sort of put together like the business logic of like, why is this the right place for the Trade Desk to be putting a bunch of resources, both technically and commercially. So I'm stumped, and I was very surprised by that one.
Yeah, cool. I know CTV is like a big money maker and revenue generator for a lot of different sectors, so I can kind of see it, but that makes sense. And to kind of move on to the next icebreaker, can you kind of share a lesson you learned in the past year that significantly influenced your approach to digital advertising?
Yeah. Boy, I don't know how to frame that one up, but I know the topic. It's related to made for advertising. I think I learned a lot of lessons with the rise and then pretty rapid decline of MFA over the course of the last 12 months.
Hmm.
And, maybe for me, sort of like the biggest lesson learned there is, I'm sure this is something we'll talk about more generally today. I wish in retrospect I had had a more nuanced approach to thinking about paid traffic. And I think there was an industry-wide sort of movement to sort of villainize paid traffic. So like publishers who buy paid traffic are in some way bad.
Hmm.
And I regret doing that. And I think the industry made a real misstep by sort of like generally sort of framing things that way. I think paid traffic is essential for the viability, at least of the web. I think every web publisher is going to have to figure out how to buy paid traffic in an effective way. I think what we've learned from Made for Advertising is there's one very ineffective way to buy traffic, which is to arbitrage the spread between traffic acquisition costs and single session revenue. That is the thing that at least I mean when I'm talking about Made for Advertising supply. But I feel like I didn't talk about that with enough nuance, and I contributed, I think, to an industry villainization of paid traffic, which is a real misstep.
Interesting, interesting. I know one of the big conversations around MFA last year was just kind of how to define it. I know paid traffic was part of the definition, but it wasn't the full definition.
Yeah.
So, like, how did you kind of differentiate? Okay, this is good paid traffic. This is, or if there isn't even a quote unquote bad paid traffic, and like, how did that change it? How did you change your mind on that? If that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think so. I'll try to be concise about this, but for us, when we say made for advertising, we mean publishers whose business model is ad arbitrage. And what that means is they get the overwhelming majority of their traffic through paid sources,
Hmm.
mostly Facebook advertising, but also clickbaity ads that run on content recommendations widgets, and that they overcome that traffic acquisition cost by figuring out a bunch of monetization techniques so that in a single user session they can fully recoup and then some the cost of buying traffic. And so if you buy a click for 5 cents, you got to sell more than 5 cents worth of advertising in that user session.
Hmm.
um, that's what I mean by made for advertising. And I think the reason I object to MFA is that the only way to cover those traffic acquisition costs, if you are only selling programmatic advertising, is to sell a ludicrous ad load, 50 impressions or so in a single user session. And I think the data is quite clear that if you do that, those ad products are not effective for marketers. They don't affect consumer purchase decisions. So that's why I don't think made for advertising is a good investment for marketers.
Hmm.
Um, but the paid traffic's not the problem. The problem is like this ridiculous user experience. And so if you could if you could buy paid traffic without creating that crazy 50 impressions per user session experience, well, that should be celebrated. And I think there's some very early signs that some publishers are figuring that out. The way that definitely exists today is to not simply sell 50 RTB traded banner ads, but to sell some RTB traded banner ads, also perhaps have a sponsorship, also have affiliate links that create e-commerce revenue. And in that way, you can create a very respectful user experience without, or sort of while, being highly dependent on paid traffic or sourcing paid traffic. I think that exists. The one that doesn't exist, but that I'm optimistic about, is web publishers building the same kind of consumer lifetime value rigor that mobile app developers have. Like if you install, I don't know the economics of mobile apps as well, but the cost of paying to install a mobile app is many multiples of what it costs to buy a click on the web. And so there's just no way you can recoup those app install costs as an app developer in a single user session. You got to bet that you are going to build a long-term relationship with this user. And over the course of 2 or 10 or 100 sessions, you're going to have a profitable customer lifetime value. I don't think web publishers have that level of rigor or have that. That's not like a discipline that exists for most web publishers. But if some publishers could develop that discipline, then potentially they could start to acquire paid traffic, be willing to take a loss on the first session on the bet that their content is so compelling or they've captured the user's email address or whatever else that they can create return visits that eventually recover those traffic acquisition costs.
Got you, got you. And as you were talking, I just wanted to say someone did shout you out in the comments, Chris. They said Chris was very helpful to many AA pubs and helped for free. So just wanted to get that shout out. So thank you. Thank you. And that also, as we hop into the Q&A, this reminds me, as me and Chris are talking, if you have any questions or comments about what we're talking about, or any questions or comments of your own, please pop them into the comments and I'll make sure to read them out as we go along. But to kind of pivot into the Q&A, I think it was great that you went off of paid traffic, because that is kind of part of the first question that I wanted to talk to you about. And kind of like one of the things that was big within this year was the dominance of walled gardens. And we'll kind of deeper into the conversation, we'll get into the conversation about what regulators are thinking about that. But as you were talking about platforms like Google and Facebook are having increasing dominance of web traffic referrals, what innovative approaches can publishers take to reduce their dependence on paid traffic and while maintaining profitability?
I don't know that I have a good answer here. I mean, I think there are sort of like two sides of this equation for publishers. This is sort of like stating the obvious, but there's, what does it take to create some sort of like sustainable level of traffic? Like publishers are basically fixed cost businesses. And so if you get one user session, your business fails. And if you get a zillion user sessions, your business succeeds. And so, like, what are the techniques to get some critical mass of traffic? I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I think paid traffic is a big part of it.
Hmm.
Um, I think the other question is the other thing that obviously relates to this is, well, what's the RPM? That RPM is what's going to dictate like whether you can have sustainable economics as a publisher with 1,000 sessions or 1,000,000 sessions or 100 million sessions. And so I feel a little bit more informed on the RPM side of this thing. And what I think I'm seeing quite clearly, I'm not sure that all this is a good thing for the industry, but I think it's a very clear thing that is happening, is that programmatic monetization, kind of like being a publishing business, is a fixed cost endeavor. And like if you're going to be world class at programmatic monetization, you got to make a bunch of fixed cost investments, which goes way beyond, maintaining the latest version of Prebid, which you do need to do, and that's also a fixed cost effort to make sure you're always on the current version of Prebid. But it's like lots of other sort of like next level yield optimization techniques, dynamic flooring, traffic shaping, um, integrating with alternative identity providers, and wrestling with like the ways of executing alternative identities in ways that are revenue maximizing, but also in compliance with DSP and SSP policies. These are just hard, complicated things that require the same amount of effort if you're a tiny little publisher or if you're a giant publisher. And so, one of the things that I think I'm seeing pretty clearly is there's a very big RPM delta between the most sophisticated and the least sophisticated publishers. And B, more and more mid-sized publishers, not just independent content creators, but mid-sized publishers are making a rational choice to hand over the monetization process to a third party. Most obviously, those third parties are the sales houses like Raptive and Mediavine and Freestar and Playwire and several others. And those businesses, I think, are in a very healthy position and are gaining overall share of the web. But then less obviously, there are sort of like back of house companies that you can hire essentially as like a SaaS provider to sort of manage the sophistication that's required to be best in class at yield. Anyway, I think that's going to be a bigger and bigger thing that happens. I think there's going to be fewer and fewer companies that kind of act as aggregators of publisher supply. I think
Hmm.
fewer and fewer publishers are going to be able to rationally justify, having a fully in-house yield team. Publishers do need to take control of all their traffic, obviously, but like the RPM side of this thing, I think increasingly gets outsourced.
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot to unpack there, but I think some of the major points that I'm kind of taking away is one, the supply chain is so complex with the publishers and the buyers and all the intermediaries in there, and then all the competition that you have to go through as publishers, especially as a small publisher, mid-sized publisher who are kind of competing against some of these large publishers, and the fact that the industry is changing so drastically and affecting the way that traffic is referred and different things like that. So there's a lot of stuff to unpack, especially as the industry is changing so drastically.
Well, if I can just like take one beat on that.
Hmm.
Um, this thing plays out in like all sorts of little ways. We had a publisher, like one of the big publishers that we worked with, reached out last week. I don't think it's appropriate to share a lot of the details, but the point is like they think they saw evidence that some big buyers were blocking an important part of their portfolio. Like, why is this happening? Like, let's chase this thing down. And it turned out to be this very nuanced thing. But the only way you could get the answer to the very nuanced thing is to like kind of like know how to like pick up the bat phone and get someone at like a major DSP to like answer the bat phone and say, like, oh, no, it wasn't this, it's that, it's all fixed. Don't worry about it. There is zero chance that a publisher at some small or that an ops person at a small publisher has the bat phone. They just like can't get the call,
Hmm.
The major sales houses can. And I just think it's like a million little things like that that make it increasingly difficult for publishers to go it alone.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. And a little bit of a pivot, we were talking a little bit about kind of the wall gardens and kind of some of the bigger players and kind of how much power they have, like compared to some of the smaller publishers. And one of the major things that was going on over the course of years, but especially this year, was the Google and DOJ trial. And as decisions are coming in, people are wondering, is it going to break up Google's ad tech business? So I would wanted to hear your kind of point of view. Have you been following it closely? Do you think Google's going to have to break up their business, and what kind of effect do you think that will have on the ad tech supply chain?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty here. I didn't follow. I followed it probably as closely as everyone else on this call did. Read the
Mhm.
Monopoly report every day. That's like the one.
Yeah.
Harry did an amazing job, I thought.
Mhm.
But that is the entirety of my knowledge about this case. So I don't know. I don't know that I can go deep on it, but I think there are two things that are maybe worth highlighting here that are slightly less obvious. The first is there's so much nuance to what a breakup would even mean that I'm not super confident it can get executed in a constructive way.
Mm,
Um, and I think the search case is a good reference point. The remedy seems like the remedy that is sort of like being floated around for the search case is for Google to spin out Chrome. And I'm no search expert, but like I really struggle to see how that in any way addresses this potential issue of Google paying Apple a $20 billion a year bounty in order to secure default search status on Safari. It's it's going to make an awesome New York Times headline if that goes through. And it's going to feel like a big win to, the DOJ. But like, what does it actually accomplish? And I worry there could be like a similar kind of a thing in the ad tech case, which is even more esoteric than search,
mhm.
that what may wind up happening is some kind of a action that like creates the illusion of a big structural change without actually creating a big structural change. I just think that's a risk. I worry about that. But the other thing is, I think my main learning from reading the details of the Google case is they did the same thing that almost every other ad tech company is trying to do. They just did it better. Like many ad tech companies have the strategy of using the sell side as a beachhead to build out a large demand side business, or more commonly the other way around, taking a very powerful buy side business and using that as a wedge to create preferred access to publisher supply. I mean, I don't think any because of the way I just framed it, I won't sort of name specific companies. Like you just go down the list of successful ad tech companies, they all have a strategy of leveraging their strength on one side of the market to create an advantage on the other side of the market. And so, yeah, we should probably fix this Google thing. It's ridiculous. They like absolutely abused their position in the market. But I just feel like we're going to watch this movie over and over again. We're going to watch it repeat on the web. We're going to watch it play out in a mobile app. We're going to watch it play out in the CTV space. There's like a structural thing here that like just like the logical business plan for an ad tech company is to do things that are pretty close, maybe marginally less aggressive, but like pretty close to what Google did.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't wanna put words in your mouth, so correct me if I'm wrong, but you can kinda see both sides of the argument because I I remember one of the big things that I was seeing during the case is that, the defense attorney at Google was saying, like, "A lot of other companies are doing this. We're not the only big player. We just happen to be one of the better ones." So, I don't
Well,
think.
there's like a this is not a fully baked idea, but maybe it's still constructive. Um, it's like you're allowed to be big. You're allowed to be a monopoly, but you can't abuse that monopoly. So you're allowed to be big and operate in like an extremely rigid way that doesn't trip any wires on anti-competitive practices. I think you're also allowed to be really small and do anti-competitive things. Like as long as you don't have the market power to actually corner a market, I think you're allowed to do all sorts of weird things at small scale to create essentially tying, like the linking of a buy side business with a sell side business. It's
Mhm.
just if you're in like the upper right quadrant of that chart that you get yourself in trouble. But there's a lot of ad tech companies that live in the bottom right quadrant where like they are copying the Google playbook, but just at such smaller scale that it doesn't trip any antitrust concerns.
Got you, got you, got you. So, just to kind of pivot a little bit back to that, to our original conversation, especially some of the challenges that publishers are facing toward this year, like how do you kind of balance the idea of diversifying your revenue just because of publishers struggling and kind of building out audience loyalty? And what kind of strategies do you kind of see to kind of help those things?
Well, I think revenue diversification is business critical for publishers. I think every publisher, that's why every publisher works with, many different uh, ad tech monetization partners. Um, and I think that's basically distinct from, building a loyal audience.
Yeah.
Um, on the revenue diversification point, I guess the only thing that feels new to me is for a long time, maybe for the last maybe from like 2015 until 2020, definitely the winning strategy for publishers was bring in more demand partners and create more channels, more, in my language, more auction duplication. So you're soliciting DSPs many times for each available impression. I think that's like kind of that's a story that's run its course and that I think has become common practice in the industry. I don't know whether it started in 2020 or 22 or even this year, but I think we might be at the end of that and moving in a direction where it is actually against the publisher's self-interest to, fire hose out crazy amounts of duplicate auctions for each available impression. And that gets pretty technical pretty quickly. But the end of it is, I think we're going to see the very smartest publishers over the course of the next several years um, build a whole new level of sophistication about when it makes sense to run lots of duplicate auctions and when it makes sense to potentially not run any auctions at all or only make a call to one or two or three demand partners rather than to your entire demand stack.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. And before I kind of jump into my next question, I did kind of miss some of the comments on the side, so I did want to call them out. One from John Davis and in part to our Google conversation. You can pretend to be a monopoly all you want, you just can't be one. So I thought that was pretty funny. And kind of along the lines of kind of where I want to take the conversation, Lynn dropped a comment in the comments earlier saying besides the declining referral traffic that Andrew brought up, there's also the issue of aggregators providing data about the audience, and then there are the revenue share concerns, of course. Do you kind of have any response to that? Is there any kind of reaction to that comment?
I'm not sure I fully track, although I do think there's a whole new, maybe related to the point about data leakage, data controls. There for a long time, I think publishers were rightfully concerned that buyers were going to listen to the bid stream, scoop up their audience data, and retarget those audiences elsewhere. That concern hasn't gotten bigger or smaller. That remains.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's another thing that's happening, which is I don't think publishers have a mechanism today to even know what data is being distributed to the buy side.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that so much from the perspective of like audience data leakage, although there's a little bit of that. I think a proven yield technique for SSPs and resellers is to take an inbound request from a publisher, modify some of those signals, and present it differently to the buyers than what the publisher intends. In some cases, that unquestionably helps the publisher. In some cases, it maybe hurts the publisher. But I'm framing that as like in terms of like revenue. I think there's like a different, like almost like compliance thing that publishers need to think about. Of like, if I run an auction declared with a 5-cent price floor and an SSP now runs with a $5 price floor, do I want that? Do they have the rights to change that? What if they change the declaration of the video placement? What if they swap in another user ID? There's like a million things that an SSP or reseller could modify. And I don't know that publishers have any way to sort of like audit or understand the way in which their inventory is actually being presented to buyers.
Mm-hmm.
And this is like a more and more important lens of yield optimization. Like the publishers that make the most programmatic yield do lots of things to tweak the signals that they send to the buy side of the market.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's actually a great segue to my next question, thinking about how can publishers kind of have data that kind of attracts the attention of advertising dollars and buyers? Like, how do you kind of think about that? Like, how can publishers do that better, would you say?
Well, I think it depends greatly on sort of like what transaction mechanism we're talking about. Like the answer is totally different for programmatic guarantees or even one-to-one private marketplaces than it is for the open auction. But focusing on the open auction, a thing that I wouldn't say many publishers talk about, but that at least some publishers talk about is providing additional signal to the buy side of the market. Like, what if I could disclose rich information about the content categories associated with this user or the demographics of this user? Like, what if I could provide all sorts of richness in the bid request? Like, shouldn't that help the buy side of the market recognize the unique value of my inventory? And I think, yes, it should, but it doesn't. I think what the most sophisticated publishers realize is there's really only 2 to 10 signals in a bid request that actually move the needle on DSP bidding behavior. There's the user ID. That's like number one. And then like distant second, third, fourth, or like a handful of other signals. I've actually already referenced some of them, like the floor price, the placement ID, the handful of others, say the video, the video playback method, these sorts of things. And those, anything that publishers try to sort of like optimize or enrich outside of that short list of sort of like needle moving signals is like conceptually a good idea, and in practice won't move the needle at all. There's even just like cases where publishers have sort of like taken efforts to like populate a whole bunch of information in a bid request, and DSPs don't even consume the data. You know what I mean? Like the request comes in from the SSP to the DSP and has all this rich information in a certain extension field, but the DSP's parser literally doesn't even read that field. And so I just think publishers need to be grounded in like, what are the specific fields that dominate DSP bidding behavior, and then focus your time on how you populate those values.
Yeah, I mean, especially if you kind of want to get the revenue that you're looking for, you do want to work in practicality and not theoretical things that don't necessarily attract buyers. But I did want to ask, why do you think those three on the list are the ones that kind of attract them? Like, what is it about them that does that, would you say, from your point of view?
They're all super different, but I mean, the user ID is just sort of like the linchpin of the way the last decade of RTV advertising has worked. I think maybe only little nuance in there is the user, like the primary user, the user.buyer UID in the bid request, like the cookie ID. There's certainly opportunity to just recreate addressability in unaddressable situations. And I think in the back of most people's mind, what they think is like, oh, that's going to unlock demand from retargeting campaigns or other kinds of targeting campaigns. And that is true. But the other thing that does is just unlocks frequency capped campaigns. Any campaign that has a frequency cap can't bid on auctions that don't declare a user ID, because then there's no way to enforce the frequency cap. So there's like some pretty basic stuff with user IDs that is massively needle moving. Floor prices are weird. That's like a whole long conversation, but it's a big needle mover. I think the piece that is maybe least understood on the sell side of the market is that when a DSP receives a bid request, it doesn't respond with the campaign that places the highest value on that request. It responds with the campaign that has the biggest pacing problem. If a DSP has a campaign with a $5 CPM bid for banner ads, it's going to be easy to deliver that. And if a DSP has a campaign with a penny bid, it's going to be hard to deliver that. And so the DSP's incentive is to bid with that penny bid, not the $5 bid. Floor pricing has a very, very significant effect, or the floors communicated in the request have a big effect on which campaigns the DSP selects. So that's a big one. I guess the other one that's maybe worth a mention is video.placement. This is a gray area and hotly debated practice, but there's space in the industry. There's sort of like tolerated behavior where publishers can continue to declare a mid-article video with, I think, very clearly inaccurate signals. And it's a trick, and it's a trick that's not going to last forever. But there are publishers that sort of stretch the truth on that signal as well. So, those three, and those are all different. Like that one is because there are large budgets in certain DSPs targeting in-stream campaigns. And so if you can find a sort of in-stream product and sell it as in-stream and nobody calls you on it, well, now you tap into demand. I just think this is all back to that point earlier of like, this stuff's hard. This stuff's really complicated. It's not just technically complicated. It's like commercially complicated. Like what is industry norms, and how can I populate things, and what are my peers doing? I just think it's very, very hard to like thread that needle unless you're a very, very large, very sophisticated organization.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more we can pull out and dissect, but I didn't even realize how much the time caught up with me. So as we kind of end things out, what kind of final advice would you kind of give to the publishers in the audience as Q4 ends this year and looking forward to 2025?
I think this is big picture, but maybe that's the right way to end a year. I think publishers need to be very, very aware that success requires like threading a needle here. And that on one end of a spectrum, there are publishers who are very buyer friendly and just present a very clean, simple auction. And on the other end are publishers that are sort of fundamentally misrepresenting their inventory, kind of like abusing the spirit of how the industry is supposed to work. The publishers like way out to one side of the market are likely to get blocked by the biggest DSPs for being abusive. Publishers on the other end will not be rewarded for being good guys. And so there's some like conceptual sweet spot here that I think every publisher is going to need to try to find. And that is just sort of like continuous business tension. But I think that's what success looks like, at least for 2025.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's a great place to end it. Thank you, Chris, again for joining us. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Yeah, this was fun.
Yeah, of course. And as we end things out, I just wanted to give a couple of announcements to the audience for our upcoming 2025 event. The first one that is coming up is our CTV Connect event, which started last year, and that will be in New York on March 12th through the 13th. And of course, we always have our pub forum events, which will be in Fort Lauderdale in March, Nashville in November, and Austin in August. So please join and register if you want more conversations and panels like I had with Chris. That will be the perfect place to come and connect with other publishers as well. And on top of that, we also wanted to announce our AdMonster Slack community for publishers. If you're already not a part of the community, please connect with Lynn at her email at lynn@admonsters.com. Thank you again for joining us. I hope you enjoy the LinkedIn Live and hope you have a good holiday as well. Thank you again, guys. Bye.